Rome believed the forest could not stop it. By 9 AD, the Roman Empire had conquered lands from Spain to the Middle East, and its legions marched with absolute confidence into Germania. Roads were built, forts were raised, Roman law followed the army. The war was over, or so Rome believed. 3 legions entered the Teutoburg Forest under the command of a trusted governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus. They expected order, they expected submission. Instead, they walked into rain, mud, and silence. For 3 days the forest swallowed them, trees became weapons, paths disappeared, formations collapsed. Roman discipline meant nothing where shields could not lock and orders could not travel. When the forest finally fell quiet, nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers were gone. No survivors marched out in formation. No victory was reported to Rome. Only whispers. This was not just a defeat. It was the day Rome learned the world still had places it could not control. Rome entered Germania with confidence, believing the land beyond the Rhine had already been conquered in everything but name. For decades, Roman legions had advanced steadily northward, defeating tribal coalitions, building forts, and carving roads through unfamiliar territory. To Rome, victory was not measured only in battles won, but in how completely resistance faded into routine administration. Germania was no longer viewed as a hostile frontier, but as an unfinished province awaiting organization and control. Roman officials spoke of the region as territory already absorbed by the empire, a land that simply required governance rather than continued warfare. Maps were drawn, boundaries imagined, and taxes discussed long before peace had truly been secured. The forests, rivers, and marshes of Germania were treated as obstacles that Roman discipline had already overcome. Rome believed that order, once imposed, was permanent. The Rhine River had once marked the edge of Roman power, but by the early 1st century AD, that boundary felt increasingly symbolic. Roman forts dotted the eastern bank, standing as permanent declarations of authority in foreign land. Legions moved beyond the river, not as invaders expecting resistance, but as administrators enforcing Roman law. To Roman commanders, the absence of open rebellion was proof that Germania had been pacified. They mistook silence for submission. Germanic tribes did not resist Rome in ways the empire understood or respected. They did not defend cities because their societies were not built around them. They did not gather armies in open fields where Roman formations excelled. Roman victories over scattered tribal forces were interpreted as permanent solutions rather than temporary suppressions. What Rome failed to understand was that Germania had not changed simply because Roman legions marched through it. The forest remained dense and oppressive, swallowing sound and movement alike. The land was uneven and hostile to tight formations, with narrow paths that broke lines into long, vulnerable columns. Rain turned roads into mud and erased tracks almost as quickly as they were made. Visibility vanished beneath the thick canopy, where enemies could disappear only steps away. Roman shields locked best in open terrain, yet open ground was rare and unpredictable. Despite this, Rome pressed deeper, convinced that persistence alone would erase resistance. Where legions marched repeatedly, Roman leaders assumed obedience would follow naturally. Tribal leaders were invited into Roman systems, rewarded with gifts, titles, and promises of protection. Some accepted openly, seeing survival in cooperation. Others accepted quietly, hiding resentment behind compliance. Rome believed it was integrating Germania into the empire through diplomacy and authority. In reality, it was mistaking patience for loyalty. Roman administrators began imposing laws and punishments as if Germania were already a settled province. Justice was delivered through Roman courts by Roman officials, often ignoring local customs and tribal authority. Fines replaced negotiation, and orders replaced alliances that had once been carefully maintained. To Rome, this was progress and civilization. To the tribes, it was humiliation enforced at sword point. Roman soldiers carried out these policies with the same discipline they used in fully conquered lands. They did not see themselves as occupiers imposing foreign rule. They believed they were maintaining order in territory that already belonged to Rome. But Germania resisted in ways Rome failed to recognize. There were no mass uprisings or dramatic declarations of rebellion. Instead, resentment spread quietly through villages, forests, and tribal gatherings. Roman patrols moved freely during daylight, but roads emptied as night fell. Information became unreliable, filtered through intermediaries whose loyalty was assumed but never verified. Warnings were dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Roman confidence grew stronger precisely because resistance remained invisible. By the year 9 AD, Rome believed Germania was stable enough to be governed rather than guarded. This belief shaped every decision that followed. 3 legions were assigned to oversee the region, not to conquer it, but to enforce peace and collect authority. They marched with baggage trains, civilian followers, and administrative staff. This was not an army prepared for war. It was an occupation force, confident that war had already ended. Rome assumed its presence alone was enough to prevent rebellion. The legions moved without urgency, believing no organized threat remained. Local guides were trusted without suspicion, and allied leaders were consulted without caution. Roman commanders believed rebellion could not occur without warning signs they would immediately recognize. They did not understand how rebellion would come in a land that fought differently. Germania was not waiting for Rome to withdraw. It was waiting for Rome to become comfortable. The forests absorbed movement, sound, and intention, concealing preparation and coordination. Paths twisted unexpectedly, making distance difficult to judge. Marching formations stretched thin as terrain forced the army into long, disjointed columns. Communication weakened as messengers struggled to move quickly through the dense landscape. Roman discipline compensated for many weaknesses, but not for blindness. The legions depended on structure, predictability, and visibility. Germania offered none of these willingly. Still, Rome advanced deeper, convinced that familiarity bred control. Each successful march reinforced the belief that the region was secure. Each unchallenged order strengthened Roman arrogance. Rome did not consider that it was being carefully observed. Germanic leaders watched Roman routines with growing understanding. They studied marching speeds, baggage placement, and the timing of patrols. They learned how Roman authority moved, how it slowed, and where it relied on trust rather than force. Rome believed it was teaching civilization. Instead, it was exposing its vulnerabilities. The continued absence of open resistance convinced Roman officials that the war had ended permanently. Victory, in their minds, had already been achieved. What remained was administration, not survival. Tax collection replaced vigilance. Law enforcement replaced caution. Control replaced fear. This assumption would prove fatal. Because Germania was not conquered, it was waiting for rain to fall, waiting for the forest to close around the road, waiting for Rome to believe it was safe. By the time the legions began their final march into the Teutoburg Forest, danger was no longer expected, and that belief would cost Rome 3 legions, an emperor's confidence, and the illusion of limitless expansion. Publius Quinctilius Varus was not a frontier commander shaped by years of fighting in hostile territory, but a Roman aristocrat trained in administration and law. His career had been built not on maneuvering armies through danger, but on governing provinces already brought to heel by others. Varus believed order was created through authority, not through constant readiness for violence. He had governed Syria, one of Rome's wealthiest and most stable provinces, where obedience was enforced through bureaucracy rather than battle. In Syria, resistance meant paperwork, not ambushes, and law carried more weight than swords. That experience shaped how Varus understood power. When Varus was appointed governor of Germania, Rome believed the region had reached a similar stage of development. The war, in Rome's view, was over, and Germania now required organization rather than conquest. Varus was sent not to fight, but to rule. He arrived with confidence, convinced that Roman authority alone was enough to maintain control. Rather than treating Germania as a volatile frontier, Varus governed it as a settled province. Roman law was introduced quickly, without patience for adaptation or negotiation. Disputes between tribes were brought before Roman courts instead of being resolved through traditional customs. Punishments were issued with the same severity used in long pacified territories. To Varus, this was justice. To the tribes, it was domination. Varus did not see the resentment growing around him because it did not express itself openly. The Germanic leaders who visited his camp spoke respectfully and followed Roman protocol. They paid tribute, offered hostages, and pledged loyalty when required. Varus accepted these gestures at face value. He believed submission, once shown, was permanent. The idea that obedience might be temporary or strategic did not fit his understanding of Roman authority. Varus relied heavily on local intermediaries to manage relations with the tribes. These men translated language, customs, and intentions between two very different worlds. Varus trusted them completely, believing Roman titles and favor guaranteed loyalty. Among these intermediaries was Arminius, a Germanic noble who spoke fluent Latin and served as an officer in the Roman army. Arminius had earned Roman citizenship and commanded auxiliary troops in Rome's service. To Varus, Arminius represented success, proof that Germania could be Romanized. He saw Arminius as an ally, not as a potential threat. This trust shaped every decision Varus made in the region. Warnings from less trusted sources were dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Reports of unrest were treated as isolated incidents rather than signs of coordination. Varus believed rebellion was impossible without large armies or visible preparation. He did not understand how rebellion could exist beneath the surface. As governor, Varus traveled through Germania with a full administrative entourage. Civilians, merchants, families, and servants accompanied the legions. This was the behavior of a man who expected order, not war. The army moved slowly, burdened by wagons and supplies meant for governance, not survival. Varus believed visibility and presence alone would deter resistance. He saw himself as the embodiment of Roman law moving through the land. Germania, however, was not Syria. Authority there was not respected simply because it was declared. The tribes had not been defeated into submission. They had been watched, pressured, and gradually displaced from power. Varus did not notice how quickly resentment spread through the countryside. Roman punishments replaced negotiation, and humiliation replaced cooperation. Local leaders who once balanced Rome's influence were stripped of authority. Tribal justice was dismissed as primitive and irrelevant. Varus believed this would accelerate Romanization. Instead, it unified opposition. As unrest increased, Varus relied more heavily on Arminius for guidance. Arminius advised him on routes, tribal politics, and regional security. Varus trusted his judgment without question. To Varus, Arminius was proof that Germania had already been transformed. He did not consider that Arminius' loyalty might be divided. Varus believed betrayal was unlikely from a man who benefited so greatly from Rome. This assumption would prove catastrophic. When minor disturbances occurred, Varus dismissed them as criminal activity rather than coordinated resistance. He did not adjust marching procedures or reinforce scouting. The legions continued to move in extended columns through dense terrain. Security was relaxed because danger was not expected. Varus believed that Roman authority, once established, could not be challenged without warning. He believed he would see rebellion coming. Germania was quiet not because it was peaceful, but because it was preparing. The tribes learned how Varus thought. They learned how he dismissed threats. They learned how much he trusted appearances. Varus governed as if time was on his side. He believed every passing season strengthened Roman control. In reality, every passing season strengthened coordination among the tribes. By the time Varus prepared to lead his legions back toward winter quarters, he believed the region was secure. He saw no need for urgency or caution. There was no expectation of danger. The march ahead was treated as routine movement through friendly territory. Varus did not know he was already being guided toward disaster. The man responsible for maintaining order had unknowingly placed Rome's legions in the hands of their enemy. And when the legions turned toward the forest, Varus followed without hesitation. Because in his mind, Germania was already Roman. Arminius understood Rome long before Rome ever questioned him. He had grown up watching Roman soldiers move through his homeland, observing their discipline, their weapons, and the authority they carried. As a young man, he was taken into Roman service, separated from the forests and villages that had shaped him. In Rome, Arminius was educated, trained, and reshaped into something the empire believed it understood. He learned Latin, adopted Roman customs, and studied Roman military doctrine from the inside. Rome did not see this as a risk. It saw it as progress. Arminius was granted Roman citizenship, an honor rarely extended to men from beyond the empire's borders. He served as an officer, commanding auxiliary troops, fighting alongside Roman legions in foreign lands. He learned how Roman armies marched, how they formed, and how they responded under pressure. He learned where Roman discipline was strongest and where it failed. To Roman commanders, Arminius was proof that Germania could be transformed. He appeared loyal, capable, and grateful for Rome's favor. He spoke with confidence, followed orders precisely, and never challenged Roman authority openly. This made him invaluable. Varus trusted Arminius completely. He relied on him for translation, negotiation, and advice on tribal affairs. Arminius became the bridge between Rome and the Germanic world. But Rome misunderstood the nature of that bridge. Arminius had not abandoned his people. He had studied their conquerors. Every campaign he joined taught him something new about Roman expectations and weaknesses. He saw how rigid Roman planning could be when conditions changed. He observed how confidence replaced caution once resistance seemed broken. He noticed how much Rome depended on trust once authority was established. Arminius understood that Rome believed loyalty could be purchased. He also understood that loyalty could be performed. While serving Rome, Arminius quietly maintained ties to the Germanic tribes. He spoke with leaders who resented Roman courts and punishments. He listened to grievances about lost authority and imposed law. He did not rush them toward rebellion. He waited. Arminius knew that open defiance would be crushed immediately. Rome's strength in open battle was overwhelming. Any uprising would have to avoid Roman strengths entirely. It would need patience, coordination, and terrain. The forest offered all three. Arminius began uniting tribes that had long rivaled one another. He framed resistance not as rebellion, but as survival. Rome's presence, he warned, would not remain limited to law and taxes. It would erase their customs, their authority, and their future. These conversations did not happen in public assemblies. They happened quietly, away from Roman ears. Arminius never appeared as a rebel to Rome. To Varus, he remained a loyal officer and trusted ally. He warned of minor unrest while downplaying its seriousness. He advised routes that seemed efficient and safe. He reassured Varus that Germania was stable. Each reassurance lowered Roman suspicion. Arminius understood that the most dangerous enemy is the one who believes the danger has passed. He also understood that Rome needed to believe the coming march was routine. As Varus prepared to move his legions toward winter quarters, Arminius presented himself as indispensable. He spoke of minor disturbances that required attention along the way. Nothing serious, nothing threatening, just enough to justify a change in route. Varus accepted this advice without hesitation. Why would he question a Roman officer who had proven himself repeatedly? Arminius knew the terrain intimately. He knew where roads narrowed and where forests thickened. He knew where formations would stretch and where communication would fail. He knew how weather could transform paths into traps. While Rome trusted him with its legions, Arminius finalized his preparations. Messengers moved quietly between tribes. Weapons were hidden in forests and villages. Warriors gathered without forming visible armies. Everything was done to avoid detection. Rome did not notice because it did not expect resistance. Varus believed Arminius was helping to maintain order. In reality, Arminius was designing Rome's destruction. He had no illusions about defeating Rome in open battle. He understood that Roman discipline would prevail on flat ground. Victory required separating that discipline from the conditions that sustained it. The forest would do the rest. Arminius did not seek glory or conquest. He sought erasure, the complete removal of Roman power from Germania. He believed the destruction of legions would send a message Rome could not ignore, a warning written in blood and silence. As the legions began their march, Arminius remained at Varus's side. He spoke calmly, offering guidance and reassurance. He pointed out paths, landmarks, and routes that appeared reasonable. To the Romans, he looked like an ally, ensuring safe passage. To the tribes waiting in the forest, he was a signal. Everything depended on timing. If the attack came too early, Roman formations might hold. If it came too late, the opportunity would pass. Arminius waited until the legions were fully committed, until retreat was difficult, until confidence remained intact. Only then would the forest come alive. Rome believed Arminius belonged to them. They had given him rank, citizenship, and trust. They believed these things bound him permanently to the empire. They did not understand that loyalty forged through fear and observation can be more dangerous than open hatred. When Arminius finally left the Roman column, he did so under the pretense of gathering allies. Varus allowed him to go without hesitation. It was the last mistake made in confidence. By the time Arminius returned, it would not be as an ally. It would be as the architect of Rome's greatest disaster north of the Alps. The first warnings did not arrive as urgent alarms or dramatic confrontations. They came quietly, disguised as rumors, hesitant advice, and uneasy observations from those who knew the land better than Rome ever would. Some tribal leaders spoke cautiously of unrest beyond the roads, describing gatherings that felt different from previous seasons. Others warned of shifting loyalties and alliances forming deeper in the forest. To Varus, these warnings sounded familiar and unimportant. Frontiers always produced rumors, and unrest always followed Roman expansion. Nothing about the reports suggested immediate danger. Varus believed true rebellion required visible preparation, large armies, and open defiance. None of those signs were present. Germania remained outwardly calm. Villages paid tribute. Local leaders attended Roman courts. Arminius himself reassured Varus that the situation was under control. He acknowledged minor disturbances, but dismissed them as isolated and uncoordinated. Varus trusted this assessment completely. Warnings that contradicted Arminius's advice were quietly set aside. Some Germanic leaders urged Varus to delay his march and remain near established forts. They suggested waiting for clearer information before moving deeper into the forest. Varus interpreted these suggestions as attempts to avoid Roman authority rather than genuine concern. To him, hesitation would signal weakness. Rome did not pause when challenged, it advanced. Roman officers raised questions about the route being suggested through unfamiliar terrain. The path was narrow, poorly developed, and vulnerable to weather. Arminius explained that it was the most direct way to address the reported disturbances. Varus accepted this explanation without debate. Efficiency mattered more than caution. The legions prepared to march as they had countless times before. But this march was different in subtle ways that went unnoticed. The army was accompanied by civilians, merchants, servants, and families. Baggage trains stretched long and heavy, slowing movement through difficult terrain. Supply wagons crowded narrow paths, forcing soldiers into extended columns. This was not the posture of an army expecting combat. It was the posture of an administration in transit. Scouting was limited because danger was not expected. Patrols focused on navigation rather than security. The assumption of safety shaped every decision. Weather reports suggested rain was likely. In Germania, rain meant mud, flooding, and collapsed roads. Varus did not delay the march. Roman discipline had overcome weather before. The forest did not concern him. Some Roman officers privately expressed unease about the lack of reliable intelligence. They noted how little they truly knew about the land ahead, but concerns did not rise to the level of objection. Varus's authority was absolute. His confidence discouraged dissent. Roman command culture rewarded obedience, not caution. As the legions assembled, Arminius requested permission to ride ahead and gather additional allies. He claimed he would ensure local cooperation and prevent unrest. Varus approved the request immediately. Allowing Arminius to leave seemed reasonable and beneficial. After all, he was a Roman officer acting in Rome's interest. No escort was assigned. No timeline was demanded. Varus did not consider the possibility that Arminius would not return. When Arminius departed, some Germanic leaders grew visibly uneasy. One of them warned Varus directly that betrayal was imminent. He urged Varus to arrest Arminius and halt the march. Varus dismissed the warning outright. He believed it was motivated by jealousy or personal rivalry. To Varus, Arminius was proven loyal. The accuser was not. This decision sealed the fate of the legions. Varus chose familiarity over uncertainty. He chose trust over suspicion. He chose the appearance of order over the reality of danger. As the army moved forward, the forest closed around the road. Trees pressed in tightly, limiting visibility and sound. The sky darkened as clouds gathered overhead. Rain began to fall, light at first, then steadily. The road softened beneath marching feet and wagon wheels. Movement slowed. The long column stretched further, fragmenting into sections that could not see one another. Commands took longer to travel. Coordination weakened. Still, Varus pressed on. He believed retreat would signal fear and invite disorder. Rome did not turn back from rumors. Roman soldiers trusted their commanders and continued forward without complaint. They had marched through worse terrain and survived. What they did not realize was that the forest ahead was no longer empty. Hidden among the trees, warriors waited silently. They watched the column lengthen and weaken. They listened as the rain masked sound and movement. Every Roman decision made the trap more effective. Every dismissed warning reduced the chance of survival. Varus believed that rebellion would announce itself. He did not understand that this rebellion depended on surprise. The legions advanced deeper into territory that no longer belonged to Rome. Behind them, the path narrowed. Ahead of them, visibility vanished. There was no moment of realization, no single warning that finally broke through Varus's confidence. Only steady movement forward, guided by trust that no longer deserved it. By the time the first attack came, the opportunity to retreat was gone. Rome had ignored every chance to turn back, and the forest was ready. The Roman column entered the forest without urgency, moving as if it were traveling through friendly territory rather than hostile land. The road narrowed almost immediately, forcing the legions out of their compact formations and into long, uneven lines. What had once been an organized army began to stretch into a vulnerable procession. Trees closed in on both sides of the path, blocking visibility beyond a few steps. The canopy above swallowed light, turning midday into something closer to dusk. Rain began to fall more heavily, soaking cloaks, armor, and leather straps. The ground softened beneath thousands of marching feet, transforming the road into mud. Wagons struggled to move forward, slowing the pace of the entire column. Soldiers were forced to bunch together in places and spread thin in others. Communication between units weakened as the distance between them increased. Orders that once traveled quickly through ranks now stalled or vanished altogether. The sound of the forest replaced the rhythm of marching. Water dripped from leaves and branches creaked in the wind. The legions could no longer see the full shape of their own army. Roman scouts moved cautiously ahead, but visibility limited how far they could range. Their reports offered little more than confirmation that the forest continued. There were no open clearings, no high ground, and no vantage points. The path twisted unpredictably, breaking lines of sight between units. What should have been a single army now existed as fragments connected only by habit. Rain blurred tracks behind them, erasing the road they had traveled. Retreat became more difficult with every step forward. Roman soldiers adjusted their equipment to keep balance in the mud. Shields grew heavier with water, and weapons slipped in wet hands. Despite the conditions, discipline held, and the march continued. There was no reason yet to stop. The belief that Germania was pacified remained unchallenged. Some soldiers joked quietly about the weather, confident it was the worst threat they would face. Others focused on footing and pace, trusting their commanders to guide them safely. The baggage train became increasingly disorganized. Wagons sank into soft ground and had to be pulled free by exhausted animals and men. Delays rippled backward through the column, causing uneven spacing. Sections of the army lost visual contact with those ahead. The forest absorbed sound so completely that even shouted commands seemed distant. Varus rode with the center of the column, surrounded by staff and guards. He observed the slow progress, but saw no immediate danger. To him, the difficulties were logistical, not tactical. Roman experience had overcome worse. The forest did not concern him. What Varus could not see was how exposed the army had become. The columns stretched for miles, winding through terrain that prevented rapid response. If attacked, units would be isolated. If attacked, coordination would be nearly impossible. Rain intensified, soaking through cloaks and armor. Soldiers began to feel the cold beneath the damp. Fatigue set in earlier than expected. Movement required constant effort to avoid slipping or falling. The march slowed further. Still, there was no order to halt or reorganize. Varus believed stopping would only worsen conditions. Forward movement felt like the safest option. Roman soldiers trusted this judgment and pressed on. Unseen by the legions, movement followed them through the forest. Germanic warriors tracked the column silently, using the trees and undergrowth for cover. They observed where the army was weakest and most stretched. They noted how the rain masked sound and reduced visibility. Everything favored ambush, yet no attack came. The absence of immediate danger reinforced Roman confidence. If rebellion were coming, surely it would have appeared by now. This belief deepened the legion's vulnerability. As daylight faded earlier than expected beneath the canopy, fatigue increased. The army struggled to maintain pace as the road worsened. Mud clung to boots and slowed every step. Wheels broke, animals stumbled. The column fractured further. Some units paused to wait for those behind them. Others pushed ahead, unaware of the growing gaps. The army no longer moved as a single force. It moved as a series of disconnected groups. Roman discipline was still present, but it was strained. The conditions demanded caution, yet no one expected an attack. Arminius was absent, but his influence remained. The route he had suggested led the army deeper into isolation. There were no nearby forts, no clear escape routes, no safe ground for reassembly. The forest dictated movement completely. As night approached, the legions began preparing for camp. Finding suitable ground was difficult in the wet, uneven terrain. Defensive works were incomplete and poorly positioned. The camp was established out of necessity rather than strategy. Rain continued to fall through the night. Soldiers rested poorly, soaked and exhausted. Equipment remained damp, and morale began to fray. Still, no attack came. This absence of violence felt reassuring rather than ominous. Roman soldiers believed the worst was over. They believed the forest had been crossed. They did not know they had only just entered it. By morning, the army would move again, slower and more exhausted than before. The forest had already done its work. The legions were separated, fatigued, and exposed. All that remained was for the silence to break. The first attack did not come as a charge or a roar from the forest. It came as a sudden sound, sharp and unfamiliar, cutting through the rain and silence. A Roman soldier, near the front of the column, collapsed without warning, struck by a missile thrown from beyond sight. Before anyone could react, another fell, then another, each hit from a direction that could not be identified. Shields were raised instinctively, but there was no visible enemy to face. The forest swallowed the attackers as quickly as it revealed them. Roman officers shouted for formation, but the terrain made it impossible to regroup quickly. The column was too stretched, the road too narrow, and the undergrowth too dense. As soldiers attempted to tighten ranks, more missiles flew from the trees. Javelins and spears struck from multiple angles, bouncing off armor or finding gaps in exposed flesh. The rain muffled sound, making it difficult to judge distance or direction. The enemy remained unseen, moving freely through terrain the Romans could barely navigate. Roman soldiers tried to pursue shadows, but the forest offered nothing solid to fight. Every attempt to advance off the road ended in confusion and isolation. Men lost sight of their units within moments of leaving the path. The attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. For a brief moment, silence returned. Roman officers attempted to restore order, assuming the assault had been limited and uncoordinated. They believed the attackers had struck opportunistically and withdrawn. The column moved forward again, cautiously, but without full reorganization. That decision allowed the attacks to resume with greater intensity. Missiles rained down from both sides of the road. Roman shields absorbed some blows, but others struck legs, necks, and faces. Soldiers screamed as they fell, disappearing beneath the press of the column. Panic spread unevenly, starting at the edges and moving inward. Orders to hold formation were shouted, but few could hear them clearly. The forest distorted sound, turning commands into echoes without direction. Roman cavalry attempted to maneuver, but the terrain offered no space to charge or pursue. Horses struggled in the mud, slipping and panicking under fire. The mounted units became liabilities rather than protection. Germanic warriors appeared briefly between trees, attacking isolated soldiers before vanishing again. They did not stand and fight. They struck, withdrew, and struck again. Each attack drained Roman confidence and energy. The legions were trained to face enemies head-on, not enemies who refused to be seen. The column slowed further as casualties mounted. Wagons blocked movement as drivers panicked or animals collapsed. The wounded cried out, adding to confusion and fear. Roman officers attempted to push forward, believing escape lay beyond the forest. They believed stopping would only invite more attacks. The enemy seemed to confirm this belief by attacking whenever the column stalled. Movement, however difficult, felt safer than remaining still. Varus attempted to coordinate a response from the center of the column. Messengers were sent to relay orders, but many never reached their destinations. Some were killed, others became lost in the chaos. The army's ability to act as a single force began to disintegrate. Individual units reacted independently, fighting for survival rather than following strategy. The rain intensified, further limiting visibility and dampening morale. Roman armor grew heavier, and exhaustion deepened. Every step forward required effort, and every halt invited attack. The forest seemed alive with movement just beyond sight. Shadows shifted, branches snapped, then another volley would strike. Germanic warriors targeted officers and standard bearers whenever they appeared. The loss of visual symbols of command deepened confusion. Roman soldiers fought bravely, but bravery offered little protection against an invisible enemy. The attacks were relentless, but never decisive. They were designed to exhaust, not to overwhelm. By late in the day, the Roman column was badly damaged. Casualties mounted, and supplies were scattered or destroyed. Formation discipline weakened under constant pressure. As night approached, the attacks eased once more. The sudden quiet felt unnatural and unsettling. Roman soldiers knew the enemy had not withdrawn far. They could hear movement in the forest. They could feel eyes watching from the darkness. A decision was made to halt and establish camp. Finding defensible ground in the forest was nearly impossible. The camp was rushed and incomplete, built more from necessity than design. Defensive works were shallow, and visibility remained poor. Soldiers worked in exhaustion, hands numb from cold and rain. The wounded were gathered where possible, though many were beyond help. Varus addressed his officers, attempting to restore confidence. He believed the worst of the attack had passed. The enemy, he assumed, had revealed itself and expended its strength. This belief was mistaken. The attacks had been a test, not a climax. The Germanic warriors had measured Roman reactions, movement, and morale. They had confirmed that the legions were trapped and vulnerable. As darkness fell, Roman soldiers rested uneasily. Few slept deeply. Weapons remained close at hand. The forest remained silent, but the silence no longer felt safe. The first illusion had been broken. The march was no longer routine. The enemy was no longer abstract. By morning, the Roman army would understand that the forest itself was the battlefield, and the worst was still ahead. The second day began without relief, as rain continued to fall, and the forest remained sealed around the Roman column. Morning light struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the army in a dim, gray haze that never fully lifted. Roman soldiers rose stiff and exhausted, armor still wet from the night before. Many had slept sitting upright, weapons in hand, listening for movement beyond the camp. There was no sense of safety, only the pressure to move before another attack began. The decision was made to continue forward, despite the damage already suffered. Remaining in place felt more dangerous than advancing into the unknown. As the column resumed its march, the attacks began again almost immediately. Missiles struck from the tree line with renewed precision, targeting exposed units and lagging groups. The enemy had adjusted to Roman responses, striking where defenses were weakest. Every attempt to tighten formation was undermined by terrain and exhaustion. The road dissolved into mud, forcing soldiers off the path and into uneven ground. Units lost cohesion within minutes. Men became separated from their standards and officers without realizing it. The forest absorbed cries for help and shouted commands alike. Roman soldiers fought wherever they stood, reacting rather than coordinating. Germanic warriors appeared in brief flashes of movement, attacking from concealment and vanishing before retaliation was possible. They used the forest as cover and the weather as an ally. Roman shields, heavy with water, slowed reaction time. Weapons slipped in numb hands. Fatigue dulled awareness, and fear replaced confidence. The attacks never fully stopped. They ebbed and flowed, denying the Romans any sense of control or predictability. Every pause invited another strike. Every attempt to rest was punished. The army began to fracture psychologically as well as physically. Some soldiers pushed forward aggressively, hoping to escape the forest by force. Others lagged behind, conserving energy or searching for familiar faces. Both responses increased vulnerability. By midday, supplies were running dangerously low. Food was lost or abandoned during attacks. Wagons lay overturned, their contents scattered and soaked. Thirst grew as clean water became harder to find in the chaos. Roman discipline, built on order and routine, struggled to survive under constant disruption. The legions had been trained to fight battles, not endure endless harassment without resolution. As the second night approached, the Romans attempted to establish another camp. Finding suitable ground was even more difficult than before. The forest offered no clearings large enough for proper defenses. The camp was hastily assembled, its perimeter uneven and poorly fortified. Many soldiers were too exhausted to complete defensive works properly. That night, the attacks continued. Germanic warriors probed the camp repeatedly, striking weak points and retreating before resistance could form. Sleep became impossible. Every sound in the darkness triggered alarm. Roman soldiers began to realize that the forest itself was hostile. There was no clear enemy line to break, no moment of decisive engagement. The war had become a test of endurance. The third day began with no improvement in conditions. Rain fell again, heavier than before. The road ahead was barely recognizable as a road at all. The column moved slowly, burdened by wounded men who could not be abandoned. Each delay increased the pressure on those still capable of fighting. Germanic attacks intensified as the Romans weakened. The enemy struck more boldly, targeting larger groups and pressing closer to the column. Confidence among the attackers grew as Roman responses slowed. Roman casualties increased steadily. The wounded accumulated faster than they could be treated or moved. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized there would be no rescue. No relief force was coming. They were alone in the forest. Varus attempted to maintain command, but his authority weakened with each passing hour. Orders were issued, but rarely carried out as intended. The army no longer functioned as legions, but as scattered bands struggling to survive. Roman symbols of order, standards, formations, ranks lost their meaning. The forest erased distinctions between units and roles. Every man fought for himself, and those immediately beside him. As exhaustion deepened, mistakes multiplied. Men stumbled and fell, unable to rise under the weight of armor. Others dropped shields or weapons simply to keep moving. The Germanic warriors recognized these signs immediately. They focused attacks on the weakest points, accelerating the collapse. By late afternoon, the Roman column was barely moving. The army had been reduced to a crawling mass of wounded, exhausted survivors. Hope of escape faded as the forest showed no sign of ending. The psychological strain became unbearable. Some soldiers began to panic openly. Others withdrew inward, moving without expression or reaction. Leadership no longer mattered. Survival had replaced command. As darkness fell on the third day, the Romans understood that the forest would not release them. They had been worn down deliberately, stripped of strength and coordination. The attack slowed again, not because the enemy was exhausted, but because the moment was not yet right. The Germanic warriors had achieved their goal. The Roman army was broken. What remained was only the final act. The legions would not escape the forest. They would not regroup. They would not recover. The destruction of Rome's presence in Germania was nearly complete, and with the coming dawn, the forest would close one last time. By the fourth day, the Roman army no longer resembled an army in any recognizable form. What remained of the legions moved as a broken mass, slowed by wounds, exhaustion, and the certainty that escape was no longer possible. The forest ahead narrowed into a confined stretch of land bordered by marshes, rising ground, and dense woodland. The path offered no room to maneuver and no space to regroup. This was not coincidence. The Germanic warriors had guided the Romans here deliberately. Ahead of them lay earthworks built quietly in advance, low walls of packed soil reinforced with timber and brush. From behind these barriers, the forest waited in silence. The Romans saw the fortifications too late to change course. Turning back was impossible, as the road behind them had already collapsed into chaos and death. The legions advanced slowly, burdened by wounded men who could barely walk. Armor hung loose on exhausted bodies. Shields were dented, cracked, or abandoned entirely. Many soldiers carried weapons only out of habit, lacking the strength to use them effectively. Rain continued to fall, mixing blood and mud into the ground beneath their feet. The air felt heavy and suffocating. There was no sense of momentum, only resignation. When the attack began, it was immediate and overwhelming. Germanic warriors surged from the forest and behind the earthworks, striking from every direction at once. This was no longer harassment. This was annihilation. Missiles flew at close range, followed by warriors charging directly into the weakened Roman mass. The Romans attempted to form defensive lines, but there was no space and no coordination left. Groups fought wherever they stood, isolated and surrounded within moments. The forest echoed with shouting, screams, and the clash of steel. Germanic warriors pressed the attack relentlessly, no longer withdrawing after brief strikes. They knew the moment had come. Roman resistance was fierce but disorganized. Centurions tried to rally their men, raising voices above the chaos. Many were cut down almost immediately. The loss of leadership accelerated the collapse. Standards fell into the mud, trampled beneath fleeing and fighting soldiers alike. Some Romans attempted to break through the earthworks, only to be cut down at close quarters. Others were driven toward the marshes, where mud and water claimed them as surely as enemy blades. The battlefield became a series of small, desperate struggles rather than a single engagement. Every man fought for survival, not victory. Varus remained with the center of the remnants, witnessing the destruction around him. He understood now that the legions were lost. There would be no recovery. There would be no retreat. There would be no message of victory sent to Rome. Rather than be captured alive, Varus chose death. According to Roman custom, he fell upon his sword, ending his life amid the chaos. Other officers followed his example, unwilling to survive the disaster they had helped create. The death of Varus marked the end of Roman command. What remained was slaughter. Germanic warriors showed no mercy, striking down exhausted soldiers who could no longer resist. Some Romans threw down their weapons, hoping for surrender. Few were spared. The destruction was methodical and complete. The earthworks confined the Romans, preventing escape and forcing them into killing zones. Bodies piled against barriers and trees. The ground disappeared beneath layers of fallen men. The forest absorbed the sounds of the dying, indifferent and unmoved. By the end of the fighting, organized resistance had ceased entirely. Scattered survivors attempted to flee into the woods, only to be hunted down or captured. Very few would ever return to Roman lands. The legions that had entered Germania were gone. 3 standards, symbols of Roman power, were taken by the tribes. The bodies of thousands were left unburied, abandoned to the forest. The battlefield was not cleared. The forest reclaimed it. Silence returned gradually, broken only by the movement of scavengers and the wounded who would not survive the night. The Germanic warriors withdrew into the trees, leaving destruction behind them. They had achieved something no enemy had accomplished in generations. They had erased Roman legions completely. There was no triumphal march, no celebration visible to the outside world, only absence. Where Roman authority had once moved freely, nothing remained. The forest stood unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. But Rome would feel the loss immediately. 3 legions had vanished without trace. No survivors marched home in formation. No official report softened the truth. The legions were simply gone. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was over. Rome's confidence in its northern frontier died with it, and the silence that followed was louder than any defeat Rome had ever known. When the fighting ended, the forest did not change. Rain continued to fall through the canopy, washing blood into the soil and leaving no clear trace of what had occurred. The battlefield was not cleared or claimed. Bodies lay where they had fallen, scattered along the road, piled near earthworks, and trapped in marshes. Roman soldiers remained unburied, their armor slowly rusting beneath leaves and mud. No Roman patrol returned to recover the dead. No priests arrived to perform rites. The forest became their grave. Germanic warriors moved through the aftermath in silence, searching for survivors and collecting weapons. Roman standards were taken as trophies, powerful symbols of victory and defiance. Captured soldiers were bound and led away, not as prisoners of war, but as proof of Rome's defeat. Some were enslaved. Others were sacrificed in rituals meant to seal the victory and honor the gods. Few would ever be heard from again. The tribes did not pursue Roman territory aggressively after the battle. They did not need to. The destruction itself was the message. Roman forts east of the Rhine were abandoned quickly once the scale of the disaster became known. Garrisons withdrew, burning supplies and dismantling defenses as they retreated. The road network that Rome had begun to build into Germania was left unfinished. Paths disappeared back into the forest. The land erased Roman presence almost immediately. For weeks, no clear information reached Rome. Rumors spread faster than facts. Merchants spoke of legions gone missing. Refugees spoke of slaughter and betrayal. Officials struggled to confirm the truth. It was difficult to accept that 3 entire legions had vanished. When confirmation finally arrived, it came without detail. There was no list of survivors, no clear account of how the defeat had unfolded, only the knowledge that the legions were gone. In Germania, the battlefield remained untouched. The forest reclaimed weapons, armor, and bodies alike. Animals scavenged the fallen. Trees grew over blood-soaked ground. Time softened nothing. Years later, Roman forces returning to the region would find bones still scattered among the trees. Helmets lay half buried in the soil. Broken weapons rested where they had fallen. The remains of Roman soldiers were discovered piled together, a silent testimony to their final moments. Even hardened Roman veterans were disturbed by what they found. The scale of the loss was undeniable. The tribes preserved the memory of the battle through stories rather than monuments. The forest itself became the marker. Certain paths were avoided. Certain places were remembered. The land carried the weight of what had happened without needing explanation. Rome responded cautiously. There was no immediate attempt to reclaim the territory. No swift retaliation marched east. The empire paused. The shock of Teutoburg forced Rome to reconsider its limits. For the first time in generations, expansion stopped. The Rhine was no longer seen as a temporary boundary. It became a permanent one. Germania was no longer a province in waiting. It was a warning. Roman commanders spoke of the forest with unease. The terrain was no longer described as difficult. It was described as dangerous. The idea of endless Roman control began to fracture. The empire remained powerful, but it was no longer unquestioned. In the years that followed, Rome would return to Germania with vengeance and caution, but never with the assumption of control. The memory of Teutoburg shaped every future campaign in the region. Roman soldiers carried that memory with them. The knowledge that legions could disappear without trace altered how Rome fought. Fear entered Roman strategy. Back in Rome, families waited for news that would never come. Names were called that received no answer. Entire communities lost fathers, sons, and brothers. There were no bodies to bury, no closure, only absence. The silence that followed Teutoburg was more devastating than the battle itself. Rome had lost not only men, but certainty. The empire survived, but it did so with restraint. The forest had proven that Roman power had limits, and those limits were written into Roman memory forever. The news reached Rome slowly, carried by fragmented reports and rumors that seemed too extreme to be true. At first, officials refused to believe that 3 entire legions could simply disappear. Rome had lost battles before, but never in silence and never without survivors. As confirmations accumulated, denial gave way to shock. The names of the legions were spoken aloud with disbelief, as if repeating them might bring them back. 17th, 18th, 19th. They would never be used again. Emperor Augustus received the news with visible devastation. According to later accounts, he wandered his palace calling out for Varus to return his legions. The confidence that had defined his reign fractured in that moment. Rome had not merely lost soldiers, it had lost certainty. Emergency measures were enacted across the empire. Garrisons were reinforced. Recruitment was accelerated. Defensive positions along the Rhine were strengthened immediately. The frontier hardened. Where Rome once planned expansion, it now planned containment. Germania was no longer discussed as a province. It was discussed as a boundary that must not be crossed lightly. Roman commanders re-evaluated how wars were fought beyond the familiar landscapes of the Mediterranean. Terrain became a primary concern rather than an afterthought. Intelligence was no longer assumed. Trust was no longer automatic. The idea that Roman authority alone could prevent rebellion was abandoned. Fear entered Roman planning quietly but permanently. The empire remained powerful, but it was now cautious. When Roman forces returned to Germania years later, they did so with overwhelming force and deliberate restraint. Campaigns were planned with redundancy, caution, and clear exit routes. No army would ever again march so deep without preparation. The forests were treated as enemies in their own right. Roads were secured obsessively. Scouting became relentless. Roman generals refused to repeat Varus's mistakes. Yet even with preparation, Teutoburg could not be undone. The memory of annihilation shaped every future decision. Roman soldiers knew the story. They whispered it around campfires. They spoke of legions swallowed by trees and rain. The battle became a warning rather than a lesson. Teutoburg marked the end of Rome's illusion of inevitability. The empire still conquered, but it no longer assumed conquest was permanent. Borders were accepted, limits were acknowledged. The Rhine became more than a river. It became a psychological line that Rome would not cross permanently again. Germania remained beyond Rome's grasp, fragmented but free from occupation. The tribes had achieved what few enemies ever had. They had forced Rome to stop, not through diplomacy, not through negotiation, but through destruction so complete it could not be ignored. History would later celebrate Roman victories and emperors, but Teutoburg would remain an absence in that story, a silence where 3 legions once stood, an unmarked grave stretching through forest and marshland. Rome survived Teutoburg, but it was changed by it. The empire learned that discipline could fail when removed from its foundations. That power could be neutralized by terrain, patience, and betrayal. That fear, once introduced, never fully leaves. The legions would march again. Rome would endure for centuries, but the forest had spoken, and Rome listened. Teutoburg Forest was not just a battle. It was the moment Rome discovered that the world still had places it could not command, and that knowledge would shape the empire for the rest of its history.